Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I want to talk about gender flipping, gender swapping, the changing of characters from male to female, the use of female actors to play male characters. Because there's actually a spectrum of different aspects to this. It's not just about this was a male character, now it is a female character. Sometimes it's a female actor playing a male character, or sometimes it's a female actor voicing a male character. For instance, like Bart Simpson from the inception, Bart Simpson has been voiced by a female voiceover artist. Peter Pan, traditionally in theater, played by a woman. And I think it's an interesting topic because we've changed how we discuss it, that a lot of the discussion online is framed very much in a cultural, ideological, and political sense. That is the only way that we are meant to approach this. And obviously, not being an expert in politics, but being a specialist in narrative, I tend to come at things from narrative. And one of the discussions I had actually with Rodney Fierce, we were discussing adaptation and how changes can be made from source text to the adapted material. And one of the things that we did touch on was changing the gender of certain characters, why you might do it, why you might update a text. And I know, again, currently, there is this feeling that source texts are sacrosanct, that they are holy, that you should never change anything except the absolute bare minimum. And yet that's only one way to adapt the text. There are lots of different things that you can do. And I think like the history of theater has shown multiple ways to adapt, multiple ways to stage things, multiple ways to show things, multiple ways to use actors in different roles and redesign roles. And that was part and parcel of what Rodney and I discussed in our video. But again, like one of the reasons this came to the fore was I saw an excellent video on Bookborn's channel where she was discussing some of the reasons why this is done. And she had asked the question, has it ever been done well? And pretty much the answer to that is yes. It's been done loads of times really well. And half the time we never notice. Another part of the time we actually really enjoyed it. But it's only recently, relatively recently, that it has become this massive clarion call and this massive point of real intense, and it's not even debate, it is argument online. And so I thought I would take this opportunity to talk through some different examples and some different aspects of it, because there are different ways to approach this. There are different things that are being done within these various narratives. And I thought I'd start with talking about something that Geena Davis did with her Institute of Gender Representation in Media, or Institute of Gender. I've forgotten the name of it. But Geena Davis set up this institute to study and advise screenplay writers in Hollywood about representations of gender. And this is not a new thing. This was constructed in the early 2000s. And she's been doing a lot of work on this. And back in the early 2010s, her institute published data on representation of gender in media over the last, for that time, about the last 20 years. So roughly the mid 80s to the mid 2000s. And one of the things that they found was that in crowd scenes, the background scenes that of just people milling around, on average, those scenes were composed of 17% female characters. And what they then found was that created an expectation of a norm, and that norm was a male-dominated story world. That when this happened in universal graded films, or PG or PG-13, so films aimed at children and families, that because the backgrounds of these story worlds were only 17% female, we indoctrinated, or if that's too strong a word, we end up persuading an entire generation that the norm of a world is 83% male, that is normal, that is what you see, that is what you come to expect. And therefore, that creates a bias to how we perceive female characters in film and in television. And one of the things that Geena Davis suggested as a first step to address this, as part of multiple steps, the first step is, for a lot of characters, gender is not essential to who the character is, or what their plot function is, or what the character is doing. And for background scenes and for general crowd scenes, the assistant director should be told it should be roughly 50-50. That straight off the bat. The second thing was, take a whole lot of the minor characters, you know, police officer 1, police officer 2, and cast them as female. Their role is, you know, police officer 1. It's not a major role in whatever narrative. But if you cast a woman as it, you are increasing representation in the narrative without changing anything about gender dynamics, without engaging in any sort of political or ideological move. You're simply trying to reflect the complex nature of our society and reflect it more accurately. In effect, generating more verisimilitude, creating a more immersive reality that more accurately mirrors our own, in which 50% of the population is female. So that was the first step. And obviously, Geena Davis is a really strong advocate for original material that has female characters incorporated into it from the very beginning. She is not against that. But because of a predominance of male-dominated screenplays and male-dominated TV shows, that one of the ways to address that, because that's what we currently have, is to change some of the male characters to female. And by changing the first name of male characters to female, she reasons that you actually end up quite often creating non-stereotypical female characters, characters who represent the breadth of what it means to be a woman in today's world. That you can have aggressive female characters, you can have meek female characters, you can have snotty female characters, you can have smart female characters, the whole range of expression, instead of quite often when someone writes in a female character that they assign them stereotypical roles or traits, because again, we have encultured gender norms. We have ideas and preconceptions about roles and methods and modes of behavior that we ascribe to gender, which is not necessarily true. So that was part of what Geena Davis was talking about. Firstly, background scenes, change them to include more women. And that doesn't change anything about the narrative. It's just the window dressing in the background to make the story world more representative. And that's not sweeping feminism. That's not ideologically, oh my God, wokeism gone mad. That's changing it from 17% even to 40% would be a step in the right direction to create a more verisimilitudinous world. The second thing, minor characters that have, you know, 1 or 2 lines as a speaking part that are defined by their role. Doctor 1 comes in and announces that there's an emergency. Make it a female doctor. It doesn't really change anything, but it does slightly move the needle on representation of women in these texts without altering the narrative, without distending the narrative. And the third thing, in order to create non-stereotypical characters, take a character that is written as male, change the first name, and see if it works as a female character. Because quite often there is an assumption that male is the norm in academic writing until very, very recently. an unnamed speaker, an unnamed reader, was always referred to as he. And this was the academic norm. This was the norm in our society, that someone who had not been identified would be referred to as he, whereas now it's becoming more common to use they as a singular, just as a matter of course, to avoid creating an unconscious impression of male dominance as the norm, that the norm shouldn't be gendered. And that's just an interesting aside, but that's part and parcel of what Geena Davis was talking about. That when we look at the recent Top Gun film that's just come out, the new Top Gun movie, one of the fighter pilots is a woman. But we don't look at that and go, oh, wokeism gone mad, because that is a testosterone-filled action adventure military fighter film. Like, that is all about Tom Cruise as Maverick and that masculine ideology. But the female fighter pilot in it doesn't stick out as, oh, that's just tokenism. She is sitting there and is representing the fact that, yes, we do have female fighter pilots, that we do have female combat pilots. It's a more accurate representation of the modern military. And that brings me to one of the gender swaps that happened that I don't think people talk about or even notice. And that was in the Paul Verhoeven adaptation of Heinlein's Starship Troopers. A male character from the books was Dizzy. And in Verhoeven's film adaptation, Dizzy is played by Dina Myers. And the character is radically changed from male to female, but now has a love interest with Rico and is part of a love triangle with Rico. And it's actually one of the few times that the love triangle is done remarkably well. But her portrayal of Dizzy was a complete gender swap of character. It paid attention to the fact that now she was female, she was in love with Rico, totally different character, but it fit with the new narrative, and it actually fitted into the screenplay and the that Verhoeven created and the film that he directed. That it worked really, really well. So part of that, the reasoning for that Verhoeven had, was when we imagine the frontline forces, 60 years ago, it would be very hard to imagine men and women on the front line, that we thought of soldiers as a very male and masculine role. But now we're used to men and women serving in combat roles. And therefore the depiction of women as soldiers is actually much better, because now that we have it in narrative, now that we have it in things like Starship Troopers, we can think of women in those roles. And it reflects the reality of what the military is. Whereas if all of the soldiers were male, quite often we wouldn't even notice that all the soldiers suddenly were male, because that's part and parcel of sort of the unconscious bias that we have. But that's not reflective of the modern military. We do have women serving in combat roles. So why not reflect that in the casting decisions of the military, particularly in the future? So I wanted to bring that one up. But one of the things that frequently gets brought up is, if you change a male character to female character, that intrinsically changes the character. And I would argue against that, at least partially, by saying not always. So Chris D'Elia was removed from Army of the Dead, recent zombie movie, was digitally removed from those things, not going into why, but was replaced with Tig Notaro. And Tig Notaro is obviously one of the highlights of Star Trek Discovery for me. I think she's absolutely fantastic. But she has a deadpan delivery. She's cast as the deadpan, cynical, sarcastic helicopter pilot. Her gender has nothing to do with the role. That role was helicopter pilot, who Tig Notaro plays as a cynical, deadpan, very funny, dry character. There was no consideration of her gender in that role. I think, as far as I'm aware, the only changes to the lines were Tig Notaro adapting them for her delivery. That the lines did not change radically because it was now a character that was now a woman. So changing a character from male to female does not always and does not necessarily need to consider gender, because if gender is not an important aspect of that character and their role and function in a narrative, then you can have either a man or a woman play it. And even if it's initially conceived of as a man, you don't necessarily have to change the dialogue if you have a woman play the character. Grace Jones played, I think it was Zula in Conan the Destroyer, which was the 1984 one. It's the one where Conan infamously punches the camel. But Zula in, I think, the original screenplay was originally a male character who was the last of their tribe. But they cast Grace Jones as Zula, and she is the last of her tribe. But they resisted the temptation to make her a love interest for Conan. And that would be, pandering to, oh yes, we've now made this character female. She's obviously going to fall in love with the hero. Because they resisted that, she's actually a brilliant character. And Roger Ebert, who, wasn't always generous with his praise for films like this, specifically praised Grace Jones in it because he thought her performance was brilliant. And interestingly enough, Robert Jordan wrote the novelization when it was adapted into a novel form from the screenplay. Jordan wrote it. But gender does not always play a role in who the character is. And that is something important. And sometimes, even when a character is written to typify very masculine traits, having a woman play that character can actually be really, really interesting. So you have Gwendolyn Christie playing Captain Phasma, the stormtrooper in the Star Wars sequels. And of course, a lot of fans will say, oh, but all the stormtroopers were originally clones and they were all one type and all stormtroopers are men and blah, blah, blah. But Gwendolyn Christie, her dialogue could have been delivered by a man. There's nothing in her dialogue that is intrinsically female, even if you're going to apply a rigid gender definition to language and characteristics that way. But Gwendolyn Christie was absolutely fine as Captain Phasma. And the fact that she is female, she's still a stormtrooper. It doesn't change the character. So while gender is important and can have very important ramifications, it doesn't necessarily. But let's think about a couple of gender swaps that we tend not to have noticed or even created a fuss over. So I don't know if you recall this, but in 2000, there was a film called Bedazzled, and it was Elizabeth Hurley and it was Brendan Fraser. And that was a remake of a 1967 film starring Dudley Moore and Peter Cook called Bedazzled, which in turn was an adaptation and modernization of The Legend of Faust. But Elizabeth Hurley plays the devil. So in Faust, the devil is the devil. In Bedazzled, the 1967, it's Peter Cook playing the devil. Lots of different depictions of the devil throughout lots of different iterations and different narratives, almost always predominantly male. And in the 2000 version, they had Elizabeth Hurley play the devil. And she played the devil as, instead of being a tempter, as being a temptress. She leaned in very, very heavily to the perception of herself as a sex symbol, as a sex bomb. And that's how she played the devil, as seductive in that way, in a very physical sense. And so she leaned into being a feminine female devil. And yet, when people watch that film, and you know, you mightn't like it, you might think it's a terrible film, but it's not terrible because Elizabeth Hurley is playing the devil, a traditionally portrayed as male character, Lucifer, being played by a woman. No big deal. Liz Hurley plays the devil as evil and seductive. One way to do it. Tilda Swinton was cast as the Archangel Gabriel in the 2005 film Constantine. And again, you might not like the 2005 film Constantine, but Tilda Swinton's portrayal of Gabriel is brilliant. And even like the initial impression of Gabriel standing there in the finely tailored, very masculine suit with a very masculine hairstyle as she talks to Keanu Reeves' Constantine is absolutely brilliant. Like Tilda Swinton is really good as the Archangel Gabriel, and she portrays Gabriel with an inhuman presence, and it really is quite a good portrayal. It's very interesting. It's a really interesting interpretation, and very different to the portrayal of Gabriel that we had, say, in when Christopher Walken played Gabriel in that straight to DVD film. Oh, I've temporarily forgotten. It was Christopher Walken played Gabriel. Eric Stoltz was in it. Viggo Mortensen actually played Lucifer in that one. Was it no, it wasn't Fallen. If I recall, I'll put the information on the screen. But Tilda Swinton played Gabriel very differently to Christopher Walken. And yet it was a really good acting job. She did a fantastic job as Gabriel, made Gabriel seem non-human. But recently, Gwendolyn Christie was announced as being cast as Lucifer in the Sandman adaptation. And this is the Sandman adaptation that Neil Gaiman, the author of the Sandman, is an executive producer, a co-showrunner, the lead writer, was part of the casting choices. And Neil Gaiman went, yeah, Gwendolyn Christie is great as Lucifer. And there was a huge, well, not huge, there was a very vocal backlash against this because this is wokeism gone mad. For a start, the Sandman comics and even collected as graphic novels are incredibly progressive. And therefore, it is entirely in keeping. Secondly, Tom Ellis, who played essentially exactly the same DC character of Lucifer in the show, looks nothing like the depiction of Lucifer from the comic books. Gwendolyn Christie looks more like the depiction of Lucifer in the comic books than Tom Ellis did. But people were outraged that this male character was being played by a female. But I just discussed Elizabeth Hurley playing the devil and Tilda Swinton playing the Archangel Gabriel, neither of which were received in that way, despite the fact that one was based on Faust and various iterations thereof, and the other was based on the Constantine comic book. So it's not that the source material in this case is different, and in some way there's a different approach to who Lucifer is. The image released of Gwendolyn Christie as Lucifer is remarkably similar to some of the images of Lucifer from the graphic novels. And so why is this a problem? And it wasn't a problem in 2000, wasn't a problem in 2005, but now suddenly it's a problem. And you go, the adaptive process has not changed. The adaptive reasoning has not changed. Casting decisions have not changed. This is the same thing that people have been doing for the last X number of years. But now that decision is viewed as suddenly having a different purpose, that we are mapping onto it, we are projecting onto it a reason and a rationale and saying it must be this thing, it must be this ideological reason, and they are ruining X, the source material. When we never had that opinion before when people adapted things. Um, when we think about Lost in Space, in the 1960s, there was a TV show, Lost in Space. It was based on the 19th century, was what, 1812, Swiss Family Robinson. And they did Lost in Space in the 1960s, and it has a very 60s aesthetic. And one of the iconic characters from the 1960s was the character of Dr. Smith. And when they tried to do the reboot film, which wasn't particularly good, it tried to blend a 90s aesthetic with the 1960s aesthetic, and it didn't really work out well. But it was rebooted recently in, what was it, about 2018. And they cast Parker Posey as Dr. Smith. And part of the rationale for that was every time they've talked about this and every time they tried to write the script for it, they found that if they were writing it for a man, the temptation was to try to recreate Jonathan Harris's original portrayal of Smith, because it was so iconic. It was his real stamp on the role. It's what made that TV show. And yet they felt that that would end up being a very pale imitation and would harm the narrative. So what they did was they cast Parker Posey, a woman, gave her a completely different backstory, completely different relationships, changed all of the dynamics about the character. It is a radical departure from the character. And yet Parker Posey still manages to portray this self-serving, sniveling, amoral, scene-chewing villain that is Doc Smith. Somehow, even though so many different aspects of the character are radically different in a narrative that is radically different, Parker Posey manages to create someone who is readily identifiable as Dr. Smith, just a different one to that created by Jonathan Harris. We also had like another interesting example of this was the Sherlock Holmes adaptation, Elementary, starring Johnny Lee Miller. And they cast Lucy Liu as Joan Holmes, a retired surgeon. So they changed her backstory. And it initially had some changes and ramifications for the dynamic between Holmes and Watson. And one of the things that the writers were very, very careful to do was to ensure that Holmes and Watson never developed a will they, won't they love interest kind of relationship. They did not want that, because that is not true to the characters of Holmes and Watson. And they maintained that. The relationship between Lucy Liu and Johnny Lee Miller's Holmes is incredibly well done, but it is different in some ways because it is a woman being partnered with a man. The dynamic is not brotherly, but there is the same antagonism. There is the same love. There is the same platonic love. It is not sexual. It's not romantic. It's not eros. They managed to create that same chemistry because they wanted to. The character of Watson, so iconically done, but has been done so many times. And people may have preferred the BBC version of Sherlock with Benedict Cumberbatch, but the Elementary show was doing a different thing. It was much more of a procedural rather than a drama. And it was fascinating that Lucy Liu did a fantastic job as Watson. That you never felt, oh, they're just changing things for the sake of changing things. It was a new iteration of the character. It brought a new dimension to it. And they were well aware when they were writing that Lucy Liu was female, that Watson is now female, but background as a surgeon, because being a surgeon is neither male nor female, starting as that initial helper role to Holmes and then becoming his partner, again, tracking a lot of the relationship between Holmes and Watson in the books and in other adaptations. But even more interestingly, they radically changed the character of Moriarty, because now Moriarty is actually was played by Natalie Dormer. And she did an amazing job of a complete change of interpretation of who Moriarty is. Because if you think of the number of adaptations and versions of Sherlock Holmes that we have seen, from radio plays, teleplays, TV shows, spin-off books, all of these different things, we have seen lots of different iterations of Moriarty, but they sometimes feel very, very similar, that they never distance themselves from the source material. It's just more of the same. And because it's been replicated so often, seeing Natalie Dormer turn Moriarty into still a Machiavellian, evil criminal genius, but playing it in a radically different way, was a brilliant way of reimagining, re-seeing, re-enjoying the character and seeing that completely different dynamic with Holmes. And I thought, that is one of the reasons why you do a gender swap, is to take a tired character or a character that is in danger of becoming cliched or stereotypical and doing something new with the character. But another one that I think is interesting to discuss is Judi Dench as M. And I think Judi Dench as M first appeared in 1995. It was one of the I think it was the first Pierce Brosnan Bond. And she has a line in it where she explicitly calls Bond a sexist, misogynist dinosaur. We have explicit feminist language in the text, which, let's face it, was never in any of Fleming's originals. But the sensibilities of Fleming's work were very much rooted in a time that, were someone to espouse those things on the street now, we would think of them as sexist and racist, because the modern day has moved on. But Judi Dench cast as M, and people were initially very wary of this because M, the head of MI6, had always been played by a certain type of man, that old boy network of well-educated upper middle class or upper class gent. And we see that with the recasting, say, of Ralph Fiennes as the same role, essentially following Judi Dench's departure. But Judi Dench was cast as M, and she definitely made M a female character, even though in the books, in the previous films, in all iterations of Bond, M is important and M is male. But Judi Dench made M female, was explicitly feminist, explicitly critiqued James Bond's wayward ways and exposed him for, sexism and misogyny, that he is a relic of a bygone age. And she was part of the new MI6 that was forward thinking. And when we think about MI6 as an actual organization, of course there are female spies, of course there are female assassins, of course there are female department heads and people in charge of MI6. And so casting Judi Dench as M, again, an update to a very old-fashioned view of MI6. It brought it into the modern age, more appropriate for the modern era and the modern audience. It made it more like the world that we live in, had an explicit feminist message attached to it. But Judi Dench was brilliant. That portrayal of M was fantastic. It is a great gender flip. And when people saw Judi Dench in the role, they were like, yeah, she's fantastic as M. And no one had a problem even with the feminist message that Judi Dench articulated explicitly in the film. Because yes, her character would look at James Bond and go, misogynist, sexist dinosaur. That it was perfectly fitting in character. And then we have a slight change here, but when we think of Sophia Di Martino, who played the female Loki in the Loki TV show, she played Loki very differently to Loki. And Loki, obviously, in Norse mythology, changed gender a lot, but that's actually true to the character. Loki was sometimes a woman. Loki used woman's magic. He was taught by his adoptive mother. And so we see a female Loki. But we also saw, what was it, a crocodile or alligator Loki, child Loki. We saw all these different versions of Loki. And of all of it, there was a focus on Sophia DiMartino's portrayal of Loki as not good enough. That she came in for more criticism than anyone else who played a variant of Loki. And I thought that was an interesting point, because sometimes I think we assume when a character is in a comic book that there has to be it must be comic book accurate. But when we see Carrie-Anne Moss as Jerry Hogarth it was in Jessica Jones and also in Daredevil, and I can't remember if she was in Luke Cage or Iron Fist, but certainly those Netflix versions of the Marvel TV shows. Carrie-Anne Moss plays Jerry Hogarth. Jerry Hogarth was a male character in the comic books. When they cast Carrie-Anne Moss as Jerry Hogarth, made Hogarth female, and made Hogarth a lesbian who starts out in Jessica Jones with a wife. And clearly, like, well, this is a very progressive, feminist, LGBTQ representative message. But at the time, Carrie-Anne Moss being cast as Jerry Hogarth and Jerry Hogarth, the character doing these things, wasn't a problem. People didn't have a problem with that change. And that was a change where, yes, the character, much like DiMartino's version of Loki, radically changed the character with a different backstory, a different sensibility, a different way of doing things to fit in with the fact that, yes, they are now female. They don't do things the same way. And they incorporated gender and sexuality into the new variant, into the new character. And Carrie-Anne Moss was actually really good on screen as Jerry Hogarth. But when we saw Sharon Duncan Brewster in Dune, the recent Dune film, play Liette Keynes, when that announcement was made, and even after some people saw the screening, there were complaints about the gender and race swapping of the character of Liette Keynes. And yet, to be honest, in comparison even to the David Lynch version or the sci-fi telemovie versions, Sharon Duncan Brewster does a fantastic job as Liette Keynes. She changes from being Channy's father to Channy's mother, still a parental relationship. She's still the master of the change. She's still the imperial, I'm about to say archaeologist, the imperial environmental, I lost the term. She's still exactly the same role. She's still, even if you match the David Lynch version to the Denis Villeneuve version, and you watch that scene where Paul is wearing the still suit for the first time, there are such similarities in the portrayal, but Duncan Brewster really makes it her own. And to be perfectly honest, Liette Keynes is not a character where gender is central to the role, but they did pay attention to it because they make her the mother of Channy, not the father of Channy. So there was some awareness, but that is again another role in which it made no difference to the actual narrative, but it did make a difference to the story world, because now this future version of humanity, this imperial sequence of all of these different planets, all of these different people living on different planets, now was not just all white, that there was a greater variance, which we would assume would be much more reflective of humanity's multiracial, multicultural future, that these different planets would have that. So there was variance of skin tone on screen. And so it wasn't to make an explicit feminist message or even to go, oh, diversity. I think it actually added to the narrative to have a more verisimilitudinous vision of humanity's future. It was actually quite good in making the reality more immersive. So I want to talk now about two that generally get brought up as very good gender swaps. And I've kind of left them to this point because I think a lot of it's been said. Like Dirk Benedict's Starbuck in the original Battlestar Galactica was obviously recast with Katie Sackhoff in the reboot of Battlestar Galactica. And Dirk Benedict at the time was a very vocal critic of this, saying, how dare you change Starbuck? People have said, oh, but Katie Sackhoff was very masculine. And she's a fighter pilot. She's a brilliant fighter pilot. She's a fly by the seat of her pants, hot-headed, cigar-chomping, rogue with a heart of gold. And when we think of Dirk Benedict's Starbuck, he was a fly by the seat of his pants, hotshot, rogue pilot with a heart of gold. You can see core characteristics are the same. It's the same character. So what did Sackhoff bring to it? There was a change in the relationship between Starbuck and Lee Adama, now Apollo, because Starbuck was meant to have dated Lee's brother. So there was a tension there. There was a familial bond, but also a tension. And they played with that through the series. Not necessarily in a will they, won't they, oh, they're going to be a perfect couple. But they played with it in a way that they couldn't have done with a male Starbuck. They kept the fact that Starbuck was sort of adopted into the Adama family. Notably, also, Admiral Adama was race swapped, which people generally don't bring up as race swapping being bad, and yet everyone loved almost his portrayal of Adama. But the other character that got gender swapped and in fact race swapped was Boomer. Boomer, male character from the original, female character in the new one. It opened up avenues for different relationships. It opened up avenues for different dramatic tensions. And again, it had this representation of the military in the future, incorporating men and women in much the same way that our military around the world does in a lot of different countries, not every country. But Sackhoff became a fan favorite, despite the initial outcry and how dare they, and the clutching of pearls and the tearing and rending of robes. That despite all of that initial outcry, when they saw the performance that Sackhoff brought, when they saw how she portrayed Starbuck, they fell in love with that portrayal of Starbuck. It was a new version of Starbuck. Was it Dirk Benedict Starbuck? No, it was a different character. But the essential qualities, how that character fit into the world, what that character did, all of that corresponded to the core aspects. Boomer, radically different, and yet still did much the same thing. And that is why I think quite often when we talk about gender swapping or gender flipping in particularly modern discourse, we forget that not only has this been happening all the time in theater for thousands of years, at least 2,000 years, but also it has happened a lot in films and TV shows that we have loved and enjoyed, and that we liked these portrayals, that we liked these characters, or that even if we didn't like the TV show, that actor was actually really good in that role, that we never noticed before when people adapted things and changed things and gender flipped them. We never went, oh, there's a nefarious reason behind this. Oh, this is all part of some evil Hollywood elite plan or whatever. It has been done over and over again. And it's only very recently that suddenly this has become a hot button issue and suddenly become something that people should never do, and the wagging of fingers. And yet there are so many examples of it being done well and being done seamlessly. But because they are done well, because they are done seamlessly, we don't remember them. It's all the ones that are done badly that we remember. When they cast Tilda Swinton as the Ancient One in the MCU, the gender swapping was not a big deal on that. The whitewashing was, because one of the issues with the Ancient One as a character, much like the villain in Shang-Chi, is it was a racial stereotype. It was a harmful stereotype. It was a Fu Manchu villain, and then the Orientalist wise old man mentor figure that has been done to death. And so having a woman play that character who is called the Ancient One, and everyone's assumption was Ancient One male, whether they had read the comics or not. They assumed the Ancient One was going to be some wise old monk. Everyone did that. And so casting a woman as that immediately confronts a gender bias that we have about construction of character as wise being masculine, when it is not necessarily masculine. Mentor figures can be female. Everyone knows this. No one actually has a problem with that. But the wise old man orientalized figure was racially problematic, stereotypical, was a cliche, and needed to be avoided. So casting a woman made sense. That's one way of doing it. Unfortunately, they also whitewashed the character instead of going with someone of Chinese ancestry or Asian ancestry. That would be sort of in keeping and fitting with the philosophy of the character. And maybe they felt it was a nice double step subversion, but some people felt that the whitewashing of the character was problematic. And you know what? You can see both sides of that argument. So that was one where Tilda Swinton has not been received well in a subversive or different depiction, where a gender swap hasn't really worked out. But when we think of even female actors playing male characters, we had Cate Blanchett in the sort of the Bob Dylan-esque, biopic-esque I'm Not There. And she plays a character, Jude Quinn, who is essentially Bob Dylan, a version of Bob Dylan, but is meant to be perceived as male. But it's Cate Blanchett playing him. We have Helen Mirren in Prospera, as Prospera in a version of The Tempest, where it is a female Prospero. There was the Virginia Woolf adaptation of Orlando, and that's Tilda Swinton again, actually. She's in a lot of these. But Tilda Swinton plays Orlando, and at the beginning of the story, Orlando is male. Partway through the story, Orlando becomes female. And a lot of that story is based on Virginia Woolf's Orlando, which is about the fluidity and change of gender and what gender perception and stereotypes and those aspects of perceived gender are, and how perception of gender changes the perception of character. That someone acting one way, if they are a man, is deemed fine. A woman acting that way is somehow then deemed not fine, even though the actions are exactly the same. And a lot of what happens in Orlando is investigating that aspect. And so Tilda Swinton plays a character that is male and then is female. But we also have Quentin Crisp playing the character of Queen Elizabeth. So we have a man playing a female character. So it's not that all of this is to say you can never have men playing female characters. First of all, you have the whole history of that in theater. You have drag queens, you have dames in pantomime, Tootsie with Dustin Hoffman, Mrs. Doubtfire. You know, all of these things where we are routinely happy with that, and we don't see it as an attack on anyone's rights. And it has happened. But one of the things we have to be aware of is historically, there has been an imbalance in the portrayal of women on screen, that they are underrepresented as a portion of society, as a proportion of the planet and the population, proportion of speaking characters. All of these women are underrepresented. The problem is not a lot of the time with gender flipping. A lot of the time is with what we project meaning onto that gender flipping. Instead of seeing it as a new iteration, a new variant, a new exploration of character, quite often we view it with a very negative connotation from the very beginning, in which case that actor will have an incredibly uphill battle to win over fans. But this has gone on far too long. This is a topic that's much more fun to discuss with people, because I know tempers are raised on this point. I know people have very passionate opinions. But honestly, when we look back through history, even cinema of the last 40 years, there are a surprising number of gender flipped characters that really are absolutely inoffensive. And modern writers, modern screenplay writers, modern playwrights, a lot of them are doing this because they notice that a text is very male heavy. And for those people who say, oh yeah, but that's fine. There was a listicle on BuzzFeed about a gender flipped Lord of the Rings. Now, I don't think it would be a particularly good version of Lord of the Rings. It would be interesting, but the thing that is most fascinating about their casting a gender flipped Lord of the Rings is that some of them I went, no, I don't think that actor corresponds to that character at all. Others I looked at and went, yes, I can see how that female actor can play that male role. Or I can see how that male actor could play that female role. Ben Barnes, they cast as Arwen. And one of the reasons why it is interesting, not because I think it would be a commercial success or it must be made or it's a brilliant statement about feminism, but those casting decisions, looking at it that way, made me rethink those characters, to approach them in a different light, to think about what aspects of those characters I took for granted that I assumed were part of masculinity, and what aspects were core and individual to the character, and how having a woman portray that character as a female character, what aspects would change and why would they change? Why is it when we suggest a gender flipped character, people say, oh, but they're very masculine, as if there aren't women who are gruff and aggressive and whatever other traits are being assigned to masculinity. There are preconceived notions about gender. There are preconceived notions about characteristics associated with gender. There are preconceived notions about roles that gender fulfills. Gender flipping challenges those and actually gets us to think about things that we assume, things that we accept unconsciously, biases that we may have and do not know about. And that is worthwhile in certain narratives. It may not be exactly what we want in that specific narrative, and that's absolutely fine. But it may be what someone wants in that specific narrative. We all enjoy narratives differently. We all have different perceptions of narrative, and we always have the original to go back to. And so this is part of a broader conversation about portrayal of gender, portrayal of characteristics, and portrayal of characters, and what we think about it. So thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I'll see you in the next one.